With 50,000 men already committed to the fighting at Siffin, the fate of the caliphate hinged on a single question. Would restraint or wrath decide the first move? That number and the vast scale behind it is why our earliest chroniclers treat what followed not as a mere clash of spears, but as a trial that shook the Ummah to its foundations. By the time the armies moved toward the Euphrates region, the Islamic world was no longer bound by distance, and early conquest it was bound by authority, obedience, and the memory of the Prophet. In the Arab and Muslim lands, people did not speak about swords as freely as they spoke about names. They spoke about allegiance. They spoke about how communities break when their understanding of justice splits. And yet the dispute was real, and it demanded an answer. The armies approaching Siffin did not arrive as strangers. They arrived as Muslims who believed they were acting rightly. That is the painful truth that the historians preserve. The conflict was carried by men who prayed, recited, and argued about truth, then stood shoulder to shoulder for its claim. What happens when a Muslim army can no longer agree on who represents the lawful order? What happens when the question of leadership becomes louder than the question of Allah? This is where the saga begins, not at the roar of battle, but at the moment when decision becomes irreversible. Al-Tabari records the momentum of events as the opposing forces drew near, and Ibn al-Athir follows the same thread with careful chronological narration. Their shared emphasis is stark. Once the armies were set in battle formation around Siffin, there was little room left for negotiation. The riverland that lay between them became a stage where every movement mattered. Every attempt at resolve could be answered by another resolve. The stakes were not only political. They were spiritual, social, and communal. In the Muslim world, the caliphate was not a title like a crown in foreign kingdoms. It was a trust. The scholars of history writing as Muslims of the Sunni tradition show how the armies understood themselves, not as mercenaries chasing loot, but as communities seeking vindication. That mindset, recorded in the chronicles, explains why even rumor could harden positions. At Siffin, the terrain itself pressed the armies toward a specific kind of pressure. The chronicles describe a setting shaped by waterways and the need to secure access and movement. Control of approaches and supply routes meant control of the campaign. The question of water and the strategic lines around the land are repeated in the narrative flow, because the river region was not an abstract backdrop. It was a logistical and tactical weapon. As the armies drew close, the opposing sides prepared as if each man carried the same burden: to stand firm, to avoid betrayal, and to prevent collapse. Al-Tabari's report, with its chain of transmissions and detailed sequencing, shows how quickly commanders and leaders could rally their lines once battle seemed imminent. Ibn al-Athir likewise notes the intensity of preparation, and Ibn Kathir echoes the significance of Siffin as a turning point where events moved fast and regret came later. Then the numbers came into view, numbers that our historians do not treat lightly. Ibn al-Athir, in his chronicle, mentions that the forces at Siffin were enormous, with tens of thousands on each side. One chronicler's figure, for the scale 50,000 menes, recorded in the traditions as part of the magnitude of the conflict's opening phase. Al-Tabari similarly conveys the reality that this was no small expedition. It was a mass confrontation that threatened to fracture the bonds of Muslim society. The men who marched understood that failure would not remain contained. If one side prevailed by force alone, others would either submit in anger or resist in grief. If stalemate endured, then exhaustion, pride, and misunderstanding would produce a longer war, one that could weaken the frontier regions at the exact moment when the Ummah needed unity. This is the tension that defines the first movement of Siffin. The decision to engage was a gamble with consequences that went far beyond that day. Rising tension did not come merely from the proximity of banners. It came from command choices made by men who had already lived through earlier chapters of conquest and civil order. The chronicles show that commanders at Siffin were not improvising blindly. They were trying to secure advantage while preventing the disaster of a confused battle. The tactical reasoning, as the early histories imply through their descriptions of formation and movement, followed a single logic. If you could seize the momentum, you could prevent a collapse of morale. If you could deny the enemy the ability to press or outflank, you could turn battle into grinding pressure rather than chaos. And yet, even where strategy is sound, the heart of conflict is uncertainty. The first hours, then the first day brought that uncertainty into the open. Al-Tabari, when he narrates battle-linked events around Siffin, records how commanders sought decisive action, and how quickly that action could meet stubborn resistance. Ibn al-Athir's retelling makes a similar point. Even when an army moved with intention, the opposing lines could lock like stone, and the ground between them punished any attempt at reckless breakthrough. That is why the doubt at Siffin is not a lack of courage. It is a weight on the conscience. Our chronicles imply the atmosphere. Even as spears rose, minds worked minds asking whether the next decision would bring justice or further corruption. In such a climate, a leader's restraint can be as critical as his aggression. The historians' descriptions suggest that commanders were aware that a battle could spiral into something even harder to contain than defeat. It could become a cycle of retaliation between Muslim groups. This is where the saga's first crisis gathers. Not a single moment of cowardice, but the fear that the wrong kind of victory might be worse than losing. The narratives of Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir make clear that the fight at Siffin developed under intense conditions where both sides pressed, then recoiled, then pressed again, each action answered by a counteraction. Ibn Kathir's chronicle, while summarizing earlier material, still treats the battle as a sequence of decisions that narrowed options. By the time the armies had locked into battle rhythm, the campaign was no longer something a commander could easily reverse. Still, the strategic payoff begins with what seemed, to outsiders, like mere maneuver. The reason the early stage of Siffin mattered so much is that it set the pattern for how both sides would seek advantage. Through coordinated pressure, through controlling the momentum of the line, and through attempting to prevent the enemy from achieving a decisive opening. Those are the kinds of tactics that a historian can infer reliably from the way actions are recorded: formation, engagement, push, and counterpush without inventing numbers or movements beyond what the chronicles present. When battle is so large, even a small edge can become catastrophic. The chronicles show that commanders watch the battlefield like operators watch a machine that can break in any direction. If a flank gave way, collapse could spread quickly. If resistance held, the enemy's energy would be wasted against unyielding lines. And because the Umar had already seen how fragile unity could be, the stakes of every inch of ground were amplified by emotion. But the turning point of the first chapter is not yet the decisive outcome everyone later speaks about. It is the sharpening of the dilemma. Even when strategy is sound, battle produces moments where reason can be drowned by anger. And when Muslims see suffering among Muslims, the question becomes, how long can the conflict continue before it destroys more than it corrects? Al-Tabari's chronicle preserves the sense that events were driven by belief and argument as much as by weapons. Ibn al-Athir's narration similarly reflects the way the conflict's course was tied to the intentions of leaders and the discipline of their followers. Ibn Kathir in summarizing these materials, points to how Siffin became known as a monumental trial in which righteousness and error were mixed through human striving. So what remains? A commander can seek advantage. An army can press. But neither side can fully erase uncertainty once the conflict has taken root. This is the cliffhanger with which our first chapter ends. Not simply the possibility of more fighting, but the possibility of a decision that would change the very nature of the war. Because once a battle reaches such scale, the next question is not only who wins the ground, it is how the parties attempt to resolve the dispute after blood is already spilled. And that question, how people would seek a way out while still claiming justice, was coming. It was the year 636 CE, and the fate of the Arab armies hung in the balance. Facing the might of the Byzantine Empire, a mere 1,200 Arab cavalrymen stood ready to confront a force that outnumbered them by more than 20 to 1. At the heart of this epic confrontation was Khalid ibn al-Walid, a commander whose name would soon resound through history. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, the Byzantine forces, under the command of Emperor Heraclius, had gathered an army of 200,000 men, determined to halt the rapid advance of the Muslim armies. The stakes were monumental. The Byzantine Empire, one of the most formidable powers of the time, had held sway over the region for centuries. If the Arabs were defeated, the momentum of their conquests would be shattered, and the future of Islamic expansion would be thrown into doubt. The Arab forces, though vastly outnumbered, were driven by a fervent belief in their cause and a deep sense of duty to their faith. As Al-Tabari noted in Tarikh al-Rusul wa al-Muluk, Khalid ibn al-Walid recognized the strategic importance of the Yarmouk Valley, a narrow strip of land that funneled the Byzantine forces into a confined space, neutralizing their numerical advantage. The Battle of Yarmouk was not just a clash of armies. It was a test of strategy, courage, and divine providence. Khalid's tactical genius lay in his ability to exploit the terrain. He divided his forces into smaller units, each positioned to strike at the Byzantine flanks and rear. The Yarmouk River, flowing through the valley, became both a barrier and a battleground. The Arab cavalry, swift and agile, could cross the river with ease, harrying the Byzantine lines and disrupting their formations. According to Ibn Kathir in Al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, Khalid's strategy was to avoid direct confrontation with the main Byzantine force, and instead to weaken them through constant raids and attacks on their supply lines. Yet the battle was not without its moments of doubt and crisis. As the fighting raged on, the Byzantine forces, despite their initial disarray, began to regroup. Their superior numbers and disciplined formations posed a growing threat. According to Al-Tabari, Khalid paused to reassess the situation. The scouts reported that the Byzantines were preparing a massive counterattack, aiming to encircle the Arab forces and crush them once and for all. The weight of the decision was immense. Khalid knew that a single misstep could spell disaster for the entire Muslim army. But Khalid's unwavering faith and tactical brilliance prevailed. He ordered his men to feign a retreat, luring the Byzantines into a false sense of victory. As the Byzantine forces advanced, the Arab cavalry struck with lightning speed, cutting off their lines of communication and supply. The Byzantines, now disorganized and vulnerable, were forced to retreat across the Yarmouk River. The Arab forces pursued relentlessly, inflicting heavy casualties and securing a decisive victory. As Ibn Khaldun observed in Al-Muqaddimah, the Battle of Yarmouk was a testament to the power of strategic thinking and unwavering faith. Yet, even as the dust settled on the battlefield, new challenges loomed on the horizon. The victory at Yarmouk had secured the Arab flank, but the war was far from over. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, remained a formidable adversary. And in the heart of the Arab world, political tensions were beginning to simmer, threatening to divide the Ummah. What nobody knew was that 200 miles south, a new army was already marching, ready to challenge the unity of the Muslim forces. With only one caliphal decision left to make whether the soldiers would march in unity or fracture into loyalties, Umar ibn al-Khattab stepped forward after Abu Bakr's choice, and the fate of the empire's command structure solidified in numbers so stark that even careful men felt the weight. A single oath could either hold the polity together or dissolve it into competing banners. In the chronicles that Sunni Muslims transmit from Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir, this was not merely politics. It was the discipline of the Ummah's trust in leadership, and the kind of taqwa that turns war into worship. The setting before the clash whose saga we follow begins with a question the early Muslims already knew could not be delayed. Who has the authority to bind hearts when danger spreads? Al-Tabari, in the broad early history of the state and its succession, repeatedly returns to the moment when Abu Bakr accepted responsibility and then sought counsel, because the leadership of Muslims was never understood as a personal throne. Ibn Kathir, in his retelling, frames the caliphate as a trust guarded by consultation and obedience to Allah, not a vacuum filled by ambition. And Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, explains in principle that governance is held together by legitimacy and the ability to enforce unity. Without that, the community's strength collapses into competing power centers. If this trust failed, if Abu Bakr had chosen isolation, or if Umar had refused to accept the gravity of authority, the chain of command that later armies would require would be broken long before Siffin's mud and smoke ever rose. And if unity broke, then the danger would not stay distant. The chronicles warn that disagreement among Muslims, even when the dispute is internal, makes Muslims vulnerable to each other. The enemy, whether political rivals or those who would later be rivals in war, would gain the advantage that only disunity grants. What, then, is the connection between this early oath and the later battlefield of Siffin? It is the habit of disciplined decision-making. The Caliph's task is not simply to fight, but to keep the community in one direction. Al-Tabari records the pattern of that council. Abu Bakr asks, weighs, and commits, while Umar's presence becomes a stabilizing force, direct, urgent, and anchored to fear of Allah. Ibn al-Athir notes, in his Kamil, that Umar's insistence on firmness did not come from harsh temperament alone. It came from a shared understanding among the companions that leadership must prevent the fitna that consumes strength. So when scholars trace the arc toward the later Syrian-Iraqi crisis, they often return, not as rumor, but as foundation, to the caliphal moment. A man is not chosen only because he can command soldiers, but because he can bind hearts under Allah's law. Al-Dhahabi, in his Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, preserves the portrait of Umar as one who never treated authority as comfort. The narrative is one of accountability. He is remembered for urgency in matters of justice, and for the way he confronted danger without surrendering to fear. In Ibn Khaldun's historical lens, such qualities matter because power without discipline becomes either tyranny or collapse. By the time attention shifts toward the larger struggle that produced Siffin, the Ummah's internal question has grown sharper. Which unity, and under what mandate, would Muslims continue to stand? The military story cannot be separated from the trust story, because the armies marched as Muslims under an idea. That idea had to be secured early, and it was secured in the caliphal example that Abu Bakr and Umar established an oath of responsibility that did not dissolve when circumstances grew hard. The conflict to come in Syria and Iraq would demand more than bravery. It would demand that men on the ground recognize the chain they were serving, even when passions and letters stirred them. Thus the episode's theme is not simply who was chosen, but what kind of leader makes choice possible. Abu Bakr's method, as Al-Tabari narrates it through the state-building sequence after the Prophet's passing, was to gather consultation and to commit decisively. Ibn Kathir emphasizes that the early caliphate's legitimacy relied on the community's pledge and on the caliph's adherence to justice, so that obedience was not blind, but anchored in right. As for Umar, Ibn al-Athir's Kamil highlights how he became the caliph's partner in resisting confusion. Even in his earliest governance responsibilities, Umar is portrayed as a man who weighs consequences, guards the boundary between personal inclination and public duty, and insists that policy must protect the vulnerable. Al-Tabari reports decisions that show this pattern. Umar pushes for clarity, for proper distribution of rights, and for measures that prevent disorder. Because in the early state, the worst threat was not just military defeat, it was internal collapse that would follow weak administration. And in the same spirit, the oath that bound the Caliph is not only a memory of a pledge. It is a doctrine of leadership recognized by Sunni historians. When leadership is built on trust and accountability, it can endure stress. When leadership is built on convenience, it fractures under pressure. The rising tension in this chapter is therefore institutional, not yet battlefield. The strategic challenge that emerges is how to keep Muslims marching under a single direction when reports come from afar and loyalties stir. Al-Tabari's method is to show how communications, counsel, and decisions interacted. Ibn al-Athir follows that thread, portraying the caliphate as a structure that must respond quickly when uncertainty threatens unity. Ibn Khaldun explains why. The solidarity of the group depends on how effectively leadership channels conflict into lawful order. Here, then, is the key tactical reasoning, though it is tactical in the political military sense, not on the field. Abu Bakr chose Umar as the kind of successor who could sustain discipline. Umar, in turn, accepted that discipline as a trust rather than as a right he could treat lightly. Their bond, remembered in Sunni historiography, is described not as a sentimental friendship, but as a functional alliance of responsibility. Al-Dhahabi, in recording the stature of Umar, repeatedly presents him as someone whose resolve was inseparable from his fear of Allah. That is why this chapter matters to the saga we are unfolding. When later commanders face the roar of battle, the caliph's method will have shaped what obedience, consultation, and justice mean to the people carrying weapons. Thus, the resolution is a pattern that will later become essential in the Syrian and Iraqi theater. Decisive command, anchored in consultation, with a successor who can enforce unity without turning leadership into personal domination. Ibn Khaldun's structural insight helps us understand why this matters. Once a group's coherence is secured, it can mobilize its power. But if coherence is not secured, mobilization becomes a patchwork of rival motives. The oath between Abu Bakr and Umar reinforced by their conduct helped secure that coherence, creating the institutional backbone later armies would depend on when the crisis deepened. So this chapter closes on a question that history itself will soon force. When the caliphate is pressured by distant factions and contested interpretations, will the same trust, model consultation, justice, and disciplined obedience be enough to keep the community intact? Or will the coming storm of letters, armies, and allegiance push men beyond what even the strongest leadership can manage in time? In the year 634 CE, with only 10,000 men under his command, Khalid ibn al-Walid stood before the towering gates of Damascus. Facing him was a Byzantine force of 100,000, entrenched within the city's formidable walls. The balance of power seemed impossible to ignore, but Khalid had a plan. His mission was clear: capture Damascus, the jewel of Syria, and prevent the Byzantines from regrouping. Failure meant not just the loss of a strategic city, but the potential collapse of the Muslim advance into Syria. Damascus, known for its lush gardens and abundant water, was a vital stronghold. Its walls, high and thick, had withstood sieges for centuries. The Byzantines, confident in their numbers and fortifications, awaited the Muslim assault. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in his Al-Kamil by al-Tarikh, Khalid knew that a direct assault would be suicidal. He needed a strategy that would exploit the Byzantines' overconfidence and turn their strength into a weakness. Khalid's tactics were rooted in his deep understanding of both warfare and human psychology. He chose to feign a retreat, luring the Byzantine forces out of the city's protective walls. By doing so, he could engage them on open ground, where his smaller, more mobile force could outmaneuver the larger but slower Byzantine army. This strategy was not without risk. If the Byzantines saw through the ruse, they could counterattack with devastating force. Khalid's decision was a testament to his faith in Allah's guidance and his reliance on tawakkul, trusting in divine support. According to Al-Tabari in his Tarikh, al-Rusul al-Muluk, Khalid ordered his men to engage the Byzantines in a series of skirmishes just outside the city gates. The Byzantines, emboldened by their numerical superiority, pursued the retreating Muslim forces with reckless abandon. They broke through the gates, leaving the city virtually undefended. Khalid then turned his forces around, encircling the Byzantines and cutting off their retreat. The Byzantines, now trapped outside the city, found themselves at a severe disadvantage. The battle that followed was fierce. Khalid's forces, though outnumbered, were disciplined and highly motivated. Their faith in Allah gave them an edge, as they fought with unwavering determination. The Byzantines, despite their numbers, were caught off guard by the sudden shift in momentum. Khalid's tactical brilliance had turned the tide of the battle, but the outcome was far from certain. In the heat of the battle, Khalid faced a moment of doubt. As Al-Tabari reports, his scouts brought news that Byzantine reinforcements were on their way. The arrival of these forces could spell disaster for the Muslim army. Khalid had to make a decision: continue the assault and risk being overwhelmed, or withdraw and lose the advantage he had gained. His faith in Allah guided him. He chose to press forward, trusting that divine support would see him through. The resolution came swiftly. Khalid's forces, now bolstered by the momentum of their initial success, launched a coordinated attack. The Byzantines, already exhausted and disorganized, crumbled under the relentless assault. The city of Damascus, once a symbol of Byzantine might, fell to the Muslim army. The victory was a testament to Khalid's strategic genius and his unwavering faith. But the fall of Damascus was not the end of the story. As the dust settled, reports arrived of Byzantine forces regrouping in the north. The threat of a counteroffensive loomed large. The Muslim victory at Damascus had bought them time, but the war in Syria was far from over. The Umar's advance into Syria had just begun, and new challenges lay ahead. What nobody knew was that deep within the heart of Syria, a new army was already marching, ready to test the mettle of the Muslim forces once again. With only one act of public allegiance demanded an oath of submission to Ali ibn Abi Talib Muawiyah, Ibn Abi Sufyan risked everything that had been built since the death of Uthman: the unity of the community. In the chronicles of this hour, what followed was not merely a dispute over rule, but a contest over legitimacy, urgency, and the meaning of obedience in a shaken Ummah. After the hard-won campaigns and the pressure around Damascus had already drawn the armies into the wider orbit of Siffin's coming test, the story of the conflict turned decisively from battlefield motion to political refusal. The next steps were taken not only by commanders on the field, but by governors who controlled cities, letters, and the machinery of power. And in that machinery, Muawiyah was the governor who learned how to defy even when the rightful Caliph stood Ali ibn Abi Talib asking for what the community understood as due. The stakes were immense. If Muawiyah accepted the oath, the Syrian front would become integrated into the authority of Ali, and the rebellion would be contained before it grew into a full rupture. If he refused, the conflict would not remain a local dispute. It would become a moral and political fracture, each side insisting that the other had violated the path of obedience. In the Sunni historical vision, this is how fitna begins, not always with the loudest sword, but with the first refusal to recognize rightful authority. In the early phase, after the conflict's momentum moved beyond Damascus and toward the Euphrates region crisis, Ali sent appeals that were meant to pull the governor back into a single chain of authority. What Muawiyah did with these appeals is where the historical record sharpens. Al-Tabari reports the policy and the rhetoric. Ali demanded the oath and the restoration of obedience, while Muawiyah insisted upon a condition punishment for those he claimed were responsible for Uthman's death before any allegiance could be taken. Ibn al-Athir, in his chronicle, treats the refusal not as a mere delay, but as a structured position supported by the prestige and leverage of Syrian governance. The tension, then, is strategic as well as moral. Muawiyah understood something the battlefield men would learn later. A commander who already controls a strong base can afford to turn time into an ally. Damascus and its surrounding reach had been held with administrative steadiness. The Syrian soldiers had a collective memory and an attachment to the leadership they followed. Muawiyah could transform a political dispute into a prolonged contest, where every day of delay was a day for reinforcement, for propaganda, and for shaping how the next confrontation would be interpreted. Ali's camp faced a different kind of pressure. To proceed without an oath risked making the conflict permanent. To insist on an oath risked fighting under conditions where the public could split in their understanding of justice. Ibn Kathir, narrating the sequence in his Tarikh, emphasizes how the matter grew entangled between claims and counterclaims, each side placing weight upon Uthman's blood. That single issue became a lever. Muawiyah used it to keep the Syrian army from becoming a simple extension of Ali's authority. Ali, according to the narrative flow preserved by the historians, used it to argue that reconciliation demanded submission to the rightful Caliph now, while investigation and justice could be pursued through orderly authority. At the center of Muawiyah's defiance was not only his legal argument, but his ability to appear consistent. He could present the demand for vengeance as a religious duty, thereby making allegiance look like something morally postponed rather than outright rejected. Here the chronicles show that Muawiyah was not merely a man who refused. He was a governor with a strategy, to align his political posture with the emotions of the population and to keep the movement from collapsing into simple rebellion. Meanwhile, Ali's approach was rooted in the governance ideals that Sunni historical writing repeatedly associates with the early caliphs: consultation, clarity of authority, and the aim to bind the community under one legitimate order. Al-Tabari's account, alongside Ibn al-Athir's retelling, depicts the caliphal expectation that the community would ultimately rally to Ali as the established successor. The demand for allegiance was not portrayed as thirst for control, but as an obligation for unity because, without unity, justice becomes impossible. Ibn Khaldun later frames the broader logic of authority in terms of cohesion and the conditions of rule, and while he is discussing principles, not the day-by-day bargaining, his lens helps clarify why Ali's party could not accept indefinite delay without risking the collapse of central authority itself. The rising tension in this episode is therefore a tug-of-war between two clocks. Ali's clock was immediate. The community needed one recognized ruler. Muawiyah's clock was conditional. He would not swear until the grievance was settled. On paper, both could claim righteousness. In practice, the refusal meant that the Syrian front would remain an alternative state within the empire, drawing resources, men, and attention away from integration. And then came the crisis doubt, not in a duel of swords, but in the moment when political maneuvering threatened to become a permanent civil war. Al-Tabari records that Ali was not content to leave the dispute as endless argument. The demand for allegiance was reiterated, and the political pressure continued through correspondence and negotiation. Yet Muawiyah did not step back. Ibn al-Athir notes the escalation. As the dispute persisted, the distance between camps hardened. Muawiyah's position linked to the demand for retribution made it harder for Syrians to view submission as a simple act of obedience. In Sunni narrative terms, this is how hearts become divided. Each side believes the other is delaying justice rather than seeking unity. At this point, the historical accounts allow us to feel the human strain of leadership. Ali's camp had to decide whether to continue pressing for allegiance through letters and meetings, knowing that refusal could turn the issue into a permanent ideological banner. Muawiyah, for his part, had to decide whether to risk further confrontation without conceding his condition. For Muawiyah, refusal could be justified publicly, but it also meant bearing the consequences of eventual bloodshed. The chronicles do not present him as ignorant of that burden. Rather, they present him as calculating what his supporters would accept and how long they could sustain a defensive posture while demanding justice. Resolution begins to form, still not on the battlefield, but in the way the stalemate forced both camps toward an unavoidable next step. Ibn Kathir's narration highlights that the conflict's momentum could not remain purely political. When neither side would surrender its central condition, Ali's immediate demand for allegiance, Muawiyah's insistence on Uthman's vengeance as a prerequisite, the only mechanism left to resolve the standoff was force. The Umar stood at the threshold where diplomacy would either culminate in submission or collapse into war. Strategically, Muawiyah's refusal functioned like a preparation. It allowed him to consolidate under the claim that he was defending justice, not rebelling for power. Ibn al-Athir's chronicle shows the logic of this approach by emphasizing that Muawiyah maintained Syrian cohesion under his leadership. With unity in the camp, the governor could treat time as a resource, recruiting, positioning, and coordinating for the moment when armies would meet with pre-justified purpose. Meanwhile, Ali's insistence on allegiance recorded as a repeated demand served another strategic purpose. It marked Ali's side as the camp of legitimate central authority. Al-Tabari's account reflects how the caliphal expectation was that the community's recognized chain of command could not be replaced by an open-ended grievance politics. In this Sunni historiographical framing, Ali's insistence preserves the principle that leadership is necessary for justice to be pursued at all. But the open loop remains unresolved in this chapter, precisely because the chronicles preserve it as the tension that will soon spill onto the field. The condition Uthman's death and the question of who is responsible did not become settled by the refusal itself. Instead, it became the banner under which each army would interpret every future clash. And with every letter and delay, the war became less about persuading and more about proving. In the shadows of the Euphrates, while the armies of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan stood locked in stalemate at Siffin, a new storm was brewing in the heart of Egypt. With 30,000 men under his command, Amr ibn al-As had secured the land of the Nile for the central authority of the Caliphate, but whispers of dissent were stirring. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in his Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, rumors spread that Amr's loyalty was being questioned by those who sought to oust him from his governorship. The fate of Egypt hung in the balance, and the very foundation of the Caliphate's unity was at risk. The stakes could not have been higher. If Amr ibn al-As were to be removed, the consequences would reverberate across the Muslim world. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Caliphate, its grain sustaining the armies and populations of the Levant and beyond. Losing control of this vital region would weaken the central authority and embolden those who sought to fracture the Ummah. The strategic challenge was clear. Amr needed to navigate the treacherous waters of political intrigue while ensuring the loyalty of his troops and the people of Egypt. Amr ibn al-As was no stranger to the art of governance. He had led the conquest of Egypt under the caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab and had proven himself a capable administrator. His tactical reasoning was rooted in a deep understanding of the people and the land. He knew that any attempt to remove him would not only be an affront to his authority, but also a threat to the stability of the region. According to Al-Tabari, Amr gathered his most trusted advisors and commanders to devise a plan. He knew that the key to maintaining his position lay in the loyalty of his army and the support of the Egyptian populace. The crisis came to a head when a delegation of 30,000 men, led by Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, arrived in Egypt with the explicit goal of ousting Amr from his governorship. As Ibn Kathir notes in Al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, the delegation claimed that their mission was to restore justice and unity to the caliphate. However, their true intentions were far more sinister. They sought to undermine Amr's authority and, by extension, the central government of Ali. The situation was precarious, and Amr found himself at a crossroads. He could either confront the delegation head-on, risking a bloody conflict that could destabilize Egypt, or he could employ a more subtle strategy to neutralize the threat. Amr chose the path of diplomacy and strategic maneuvering. He knew that a direct confrontation would only serve to deepen the divide within the Ummah. Instead, he invited the leaders of the delegation to a series of meetings, where he listened to their grievances and addressed their concerns with wisdom and patience. According to Al-Tabari, Amr's approach was one of conciliation rather than confrontation. He emphasized the importance of unity and the dangers of disunity, appealing to the shared values and goals of the Muslim community. The turning point came when Amr managed to convince a significant portion of the delegation to withdraw their support for the mission. He did this by highlighting the potential consequences of their actions and by offering them positions of authority within his administration. As Ibn al-Athir recorded, the delegation's resolve began to crumble as their leaders realized the futility of their mission. One by one, they retracted their support, and the threat of a full-scale conflict in Egypt was averted. However, the resolution was not without its challenges. While Amr had successfully neutralized the immediate threat, the underlying tensions remained. The incident served as a stark reminder of the fragility of the caliphate's unity and the need for constant vigilance. As Ibn Khaldun observed in Al-Muqaddimah, the events in Egypt were a microcosm of the broader struggles within the Muslim world. The threat of fitna, or civil strife, loomed large, and the actions of individuals like Amr ibn al-As would play a crucial role in shaping the future of the Ummah. As the dust settled in Egypt, a new challenge emerged on the horizon. News arrived that a fresh army was marching toward the region, its intentions unknown. The letter that arrived that night would change everything, setting the stage for yet another test of Amr's leadership and the resolve of the Muslim community.